outskirts of Birmingham since 1905. He was also in financial trouble in 21, which was when the Austin 7, Britain's favourite car of the interwar years, was designed. Although the 7 looked like a toy, it was possible for a family with small children to enjoy a day at the seaside on just a couple of gallons of fuel. And with petrol selling at 1 shilling and sixpence a gallon in 1923, and the 7 returning over 40 miles per gallon, that was cheap motoring. It saved the Austin Company and provided transport for many people who might otherwise have gone by train. And while Austin and Morris were catering for a cheap mass production market, there were other car makers who opted for the exclusive sports car market, the sort of vehicle that might have been run by a wealthy Oxford undergraduate. One such firm was the Vauxhall Company, with chief engineer Lawrence Pomeroy, who came up with the 3098. It was a sports car that was designed very much for driver enjoyment rather than just transportation. It belonged to those heady, carefree First World War days when, for the secure and wealthy, it was always afternoon. The 3098 was capable of 100 miles an hour in racing trim, but because of their low production, Vauxhall's days were inevitably numbered. And in 1925, the firm was taken over by the giant from across the Atlantic, the American General Motors Corporation.
The traditional American car of the 1920s was a big, roomy saloon. However, the gangsters who had grown fat on racketeering preferred a little more luxury. They had Cadillacs and Lincolns and Packards, such as this one, straight 8 engine, about 6-litre capacity, and good for 80 miles an hour if you're being chased. Mind you, you wouldn't do it in these conditions. I think you'd have a very big accident indeed. On the other hand, to counter the gangsters, the police got rid of their Model Ts and their horses, and they went for boxy Lincolns. Al Capone, though, in 1928, he didn't want Lincolns and Packards. He wanted a Cadillac that was made just for him. He was reputed to spend something like $30,000 on a very special Cadillac that he had lined with 1/4-inch boilerplate to try and repel the policeman's bullets.
It was in 1928 that the American cars launched their most formidable challenge on that classic and most grueling of motor races, the Le Mans 24-hour race. But in fact, in 28, the race was won by a big green Bentley, similar to this 4.5-litre one I'm in now, the Bulldog Drummond of motor cars. And in fact, Bentley went on to win Le Mans a total of 5 times. Now, the surprising thing is that W.O. Bentley only made his cars for 12 years, from 1919 until 1931. The reason being that he went bankrupt in 1931 and the firm was taken over by Rolls-Royce. But I think there'll always be a special place in the hearts of British enthusiasts for the big green monster that was known as the Bentley. And in the 1920s, if you wanted to see them race, well, there was one place you'd be sure to find them.
Brooklands was the world's first motor racing circuit. It was a 2 3/4 mile banked concrete oval at Weybridge in Surrey, opened in 1908. And it was where many of motor racing's greats made their names. And it was where John Cobb's mighty Napier Railton was unbeatable. And here is that Napier Railton, meticulously restored and creating a lot of attention here at Silverstone. It was specially built in 1932 and 33 for use at Brooklands, and it was built at Brooklands in the Thompson and Taylor works. The chief engineer, Reed Railton, chose a 12-cylinder, 24-litre Napier Lion aero engine, and this car, 50 years ago, took the world hour record at over 150 miles an hour. Well, there wasn't any Brooklands after the war, and the Napier Railton became a film star. It appeared in Pandora and The Flying Dutchman. Then it was used for parachute testing, and I'm afraid to say got into a rather sorry state. But now, as you can see, it has been beautifully restored to its former glory by a vintage enthusiast, and jolly well done too. A popular racing car that not only appeared regularly at Brooklands but also all over Europe was the Type 35 Bugatti. Introduced in 1924, the Type 35 with its horseshoe-shaped radiator and unique flat-spoked aluminium wheels was also one of the most successful racing cars of all time, even though its brakes often left something to be desired. Ettore Bugatti once said to a competing driver, "I make my cars to go, not stop." Then, in 1934, came the British ERA, and it was designed for voiturette racing, which today would be equivalent to Formula 2. One of the most successful ERA drivers was Prince Bira. He ran a pair of cars named Romulus and Remus, which were painted light blue. The colour was matched from material that his cousin, Prince Chula, had snipped off a girl's dress while they were dining at the London Savoy Hotel. And her response was not recorded.
Well, I see there are plenty of ERAs entered in the 1935 British Empire Trophy at Brooklands Racing Circuit there. So why don't we go for a day out to Brooklands, because it was the high society place to go. And this was the way to do it. You had to have the family, the picnic hamper, and of course the champagne, and the right car to do it with. This is the Mason family, and this is their Phantom II Continental. Now, the Phantom 1 came out in 1925, replacing the Silver Ghost. The Phantom 2 came out in 29, and this particular one is the Phantom II Continental with the shorter chassis. It was the last car that Henry Royce saw through from start to finish, because he sadly died in 1933, just as this one was being built. And in those days, Rolls-Royce supplied the chassis, and you supplied the body by going to an independent coachmaker. In this case, it was Park Ward. This car, when it came out in 33, you could have got for just over £2,500. Now it would cost you about £50,000 to buy in this condition, and it was bought by Mr. Mason 20 years ago for just £100. But food and wine always tastes good out of doors, doesn't it? So I think that was true then, it's true now. Join me. Cheers, David.
My first car was a Morgan three-wheeler, 1934. It was known locally as the Red Peril because it was painted a bright red, and it was my courting car, and in fact we kept it until the family grew to a size that there was just no more room.
Did you do much courting in cars?
Yes, some. In a Mini, actually. I think I think it was mainly a Mini, yes.
We were motorcyclists.
How do you court on a motorcycle?
Well, you can always stop and find a hedge.
It's
You're blushing.
well, it's a rural area. Plenty of lanes in this neck of the woods.
Bit uncomfortable. Better on a sofa, really.
Morgan three-wheelers weren't renowned as courting cars, were they?
Well, they were quite good, actually, because, you see, once the girl was in, there were no doors. Once the girl was sitting there beside you, she was there beside you. So it was quite a good courting car, in fact. But very open air, very open air.
MG stood for Morris Garages, and that was the place where they built these and many other cars like them. This is the MG Midget, the original MG Midget, and to my mind it's called a midget because you could only be about 3'6" to fit into the driver's compartment. It really was ever so tiny, but what a great little car. It would have cost you in 1928 when it came out £175. These days it would set you back in this condition between £5,000 and £6,000. But a great car, 70 mile an hour top speed. With the top down, you could easily have been racing at Brooklands, no problem at all. Of course, it would easily get past the 30 mile an hour speed limit they had in 1935. The 20 mile an hour speed limit was introduced in 1903. But right the way through the 1920s, that was ignored by the increasingly sporty motorists. And in fact, the bus companies, to keep their timetables, their drivers had to ignore the speed limit and break the law. So in 1930, they abolished the 20 mile an hour speed limit. In 1935, they brought in the 30 mile an hour speed limit, and in the 5 years in between, the road accidents in Britain just soared. With no speed limit at all in 1934, the number of injuries and deaths on Britain's road went to 239,000 in 1 year. Of those, 7,300 were killed, and that figure was never surpassed until 1964. But by then, there were 5 times as many cars on the roads of Britain. In 1936, the year in which the Cat's Eye reflective road marker appeared, £395 would buy one of William Lyon's sensational SS Jaguar sports cars, the SS 100, a 100 mile an hour car. He chose the name Jaguar from a list of titles because it reminded him of a First World War Armstrong-Siddeley Jaguar aero engine. The SS 100 had a distinguished career on and off track with particular success in rallies. Single white lines were introduced to Britain in 1927, with the double variety to prevent vehicles overtaking at a specific point, not arriving until 1959.
That AA salute will have been a bit of nostalgia for a lot of you. But in the pre-World War I days, it was there for a very practical reason. It wasn't just a courtesy. You see, before the First World War, there was a 20 mile an hour speed limit which was very rigidly applied. And to warn their members, the AA issued particulars, and they also had bicycle patrols out. But the police got wise to that, they prosecuted the AA, So the AA then said, if you do not get a salute, stop and ask the reason why. And the reason why was pretty obvious. Well, the speed limit was rescinded. The AA, of course, went on from bicycles to motorcycle combinations, from motorcycle combinations to vans. It's now the world's largest motoring organisation, which does everything. Legal services, get you home, everything you can think of. But just as the AA has always been associated with motorcycles, so Silverstone here this weekend is a feast for motorcyclists. A feast which began with a memory-stirring parade of evocative machines from the past and the present. From the pioneering 20s, the Triumph Ricardo, a great bike in its day. And the British Bradbury, beautifully restored, but looking flimsy and exposed to modern eyes with its open valve gear and its tiller-like handlebars, complete with oxyacetylene lighting and bulb horn. A great parade indeed, with the best of everything. From the 1920s, this immaculate 500cc S30 from the Birmingham Small Arms Company, BSA to you, with hand gear change, you'll observe. But then the drab days of World War II and military machines like the side valve 16H Norton, the unwieldy despair of many a dispatch rider with its virtually useless blackout headlamp. The war over, the industry innovated again. And for Vincent HRD, Australian Phil Irving designed their immortal 1000cc V-twin, which spawned the fearsome Black Shadow, guaranteed to blow the socks off anything. From Matchless, the sleek, high-performance G9 vertical twin, typical of the British industry's 1950 output, except for its unique jam pot suspension. For sheer nostalgia, though, this superb single-cylinder Velocette is unbeatable. For the masses, even the sporty Triumph concern produced small bikes, but by the 1960s, the Japanese invasion had started to swamp the ailing British factories with high-technology lightweights like this Honda Bentley 125, and soon Japan dominated the whole of the world's motorcycle industry. But the European motorcycle industry certainly hasn't laid down and died. BMW, for instance, have developed this absolutely magnificent long-distance tourer. Highly advanced streamlining, shaft drive, which they've had since 1923, and a development of their 1000cc horizontally opposed engine, which makes this bike a hard one to beat if you want to go a long way. And here's the modern version of the thing that people aspired to for family transport between the wars, the sidecar outfit. Very different now with coach-built bodywork and multi-cylinder engine, but still great fun.
And by contrast, the Volkswagen Beetle was the inspiration of Adolf Hitler, who wanted a cheap, utilitarian car in the spirit of the Model T Ford. In 1933, he commissioned the famous Austrian engineer Ferdinand Porsche to design this Beetle-like car with its rear-mounted air-cooled engine. The trouble was that Hitler invaded Poland in 1939 and started the Second World War. The Volkswagen factory found itself in the British military zone after the war, and production started of this vehicle that today still looks and sounds like no other. The millionth Beetle was built in 1955, and production increased to such an extent that the 1960s witnessed extraordinary million Beetle years. In 1985, the car remains in production in Brazil and Mexico, and with over 20 million Beetles built, the car looks all set for the 21st century. The Ugly Duckling has, in production terms, become the swan of the automobile industry.
That's the Silverstone of today, but this Bill Mason shell film superbly captures the spirit of what was then a very different Silverstone, using both the runways and the perimeter roads as the scene of some of the earliest triumphs of Britain's rising young star, Stirling Moss. But look at this, the Talbot, the Altas, the Maseratis and the ERAs going round in that Grand Prix, and here's an ERA in real trouble. But all the time, Stirling Moss was rising in the firmament. From 1948 to 1985 is a long time, but Stirling Moss bridges that gap. For my money, one of the top 6 racing drivers of all time. Stirling, I think of you as the original, real professional. You were always there on time, immaculately dressed, No detail was too small for you to look after personally. But did you find it all a bit slapdash when you started?
No, I found it fun, very amateur, and I felt that if one's going to be professional about it, in other words, if I'm going to get paid for what I'm doing, which was essential to me, then I felt that one should turn up clean, on time, and one's car should be as well prepared as possible.
Now, by today's standards, you're improperly dressed. Cotton overalls, a very vestigial helmet, Mark 8 goggles, big contrast to 1985.
Yeah, well, you know, when I started, none of the other drivers even wore these.
Right, yeah.
My father said to me, if you're going to race, you're going to wear a crash hat. And I said, Dad, but that's sissy, because they were all wearing those cloth jobs. Yeah. And then these as well came in later, because we used to run with short sleeves. So there has been a big change, yeah.
When I used to watch you racing, you always struck me as being almost balletic in the way you drove, beautifully smooth style. Was it difficult to drive a car like this 250F Maserati?
Well, it's all relative. No, this was one of the nicer, the easier, more forgiving cars, and one of the most enjoyable cars, because you compare this with today, I mean, look at the character of it. I mean, you look at the aesthetic lines of it. I mean, it's a beautiful car, isn't it? I mean, no way could you compare it with today's car, really.
Now, when we look up, there's rain clouds overhead. It's spotting with rain, but the course is fairly dry. What would you have done about tyres in those days?
I would use the only tyres I've got, and those are the ones that are on it. I might have dropped the tyre pressures, actually, seriously, a couple of pounds on the start line if it was wet. But, of course, we didn't change tyres. I mean, we had these tyres, and these are the ones we ran on.
So I wouldn't have been going on about the difficult choice between slicks and dries.
No problems. No, you could make as many mistakes you like. You couldn't make them, you know.
Now, a flexible car compared with today's 800 horsepower cars?
I think the great thing about this car, it was very adaptable. In other words, you could steer it on the throttle, very much so, and therefore you could feel part of the car. I mean, you know, just look at this cockpit, for instance. Look at the size of it. I've plenty of room, a big steering wheel, the pedals where I like them to be, for me anyway, that is with the accelerator on the right. Of course, Fangio and some of the others had it in the middle.
Yeah.
But a car that, when you're going around a course like this, you could really feel it getting near the limit, and you could steer it with your bottom and the throttle. You could feel through your hand. Enormously responsive car.
What about today's Grand Prix driver? Do you think they get as much pleasure and satisfaction out of it as you did?
No, but they get a lot more money. I mean, it's worth something.
This car, more than any other, typifies the transition from pre-war to post-war motoring. A fabulous MG. And in the post-war years, when the British government was saying to manufacturers, export or die, this was the car. It's all MG had. A fabulous two-seater, all-weather protection. I barely dried here, despite the fact it's a terrible day. And export it they did. It went to Australia and, of course, America. The Americans loved it. They didn't have a sports car of their own. They loved the MG, not just the TC, but the TD, which was almost exclusively sold to the States. And, of course, was the forerunner of such great motor cars as the Austin Healey, the XK120, and, of course, the TR.
Do you remember the introduction of the flashing indicator? Or worse, do you remember the semaphore system that preceded it? Well, this was in the early 50s. And one car which had to make the switch and was the best-loved model of these classic years was the Morris Minor, designed almost single-handedly by Alec Issigonis, who later was responsible for the Mini. The Minor, remember how district nurses used to use them, was also the first British car to sell 1 million. It arrived at the 1948 Motor Show, lasted right up until 1971, and retained the luxury of a starting handle, long after other makes had dispensed with one. It is probably best remembered in its half-timbered traveller form, which echoed American practice.
Ernest Hemingway, so far as I'm aware, was not actually a car nut, but his comment on bullfighting, I can talk to people who like it, I can talk to people who dislike it, but I cannot talk to people who are bored with it, could equally apply to Citroën's 2CV. You either love it or loathe it. There is just no middle way. In 1936, 2 years after the birth of the Beetle, the French Citroën company started work on this small front-wheel drive car. The company's chief engineer was asked to design an umbrella on 4 wheels. Further requirements were that it should be able to carry 2 peasants in their working clothes, and there should be room for 50 kilos of potatoes or a small barrel. The luckless designer was also told that the car should be comfortable, and if the mythical peasants placed a box of eggs on the car and then crossed a ploughed field in it, not one egg should be broken. Then the controls were to be sufficiently simple for Mrs. Peasant to master. And apart from that, the car's top speed should be 60 kph, 37 miles per hour, and it ought to return 90 miles to the gallon. It was a pretty tall order, to say the least, but when the 2CV entered production 12 years later, in 1948, it proved an absolute sensation. And it's remained in production ever since, chunky, archaic, and utterly individual.
Following 1947, when the pre-war Austin 8 breathed its last, Austin, or Austin of England, as badge lovers will recall, had no car to counter Morris's magnificent Minor. Ford, on the other hand, was building solid, old-fashioned value-for-money cars, but in 1950 it introduced a new generation, and you might remember that commodious bench-type front seat and a column gear change. Vauxhall, remember, had been US-owned since 1925, but in the 1950s, American cars exploded into an excess of tail fins and chrome plate. The closest that Britain ever got to this approach was the Vauxhall Victor, introduced in 1957, with curved wraparound windscreen, tail fins and big lumpy bumpers. Yes, there was the inevitable bench-type front seat and 3-speed column gear change in the Detroit manner. And the manufacturers liked the bench because they were cheaper to make and easier to fit than separate squabs. But after a while, people got tired of sliding around when the car went round corners, and the feature had disappeared by the end of the decade. The bench seat, however, did have its followers.
Jaguar's first post-war sports car was the XK120, introduced in 1948, and it was to lead to the XK140 and 150. Unlike the latter model, the 120's title actually reflected its top speed. It introduced the famous twin overhead camshaft 6-cylinder XK engine to the British public, and is still in production, that engine, the longest running post-war British power unit. Most of the XK range was exported to America and were the first Jaguars to sell there in appreciable numbers. Donald Healey was a tough-minded Cornishman who won the Monte Carlo Rally in 1931, and he went on to build his own cars after the Second World War. These Warwick-built Healeys were fast but expensive, and Donald realized he would have to have a cheaper and lighter car to stay in business. The Healey 100 became the Austin Healey overnight as BMC's corporate sports car. But it's perhaps for the 3000 Mark III that Austin Healey is best remembered. This car is most definitely now a collector's item, and to get one of these in mint condition, you'd be paying upwards of about £9,000. The 3000 was best known as the Big Healey. It was an impressive 120-mile-an-hour sports car, but it died in 1967 because of American safety regulations. In 1952, the year of the Austin Healey's arrival, MG produced the prototype MGA, though it didn't go into production until 1955. The shape was as modern as the T-Series cars had been archaic, and by the time the MGA ceased production in 1962, over 100,000 have been built.
We've seen some weird and wonderful devices in this program, but the bubble car is probably the oddest of the lot. This Isetta is the best known of them all, with its weird front-opening door, which seemed to be getting out when you were getting in. This low-cost motoring idea never did really catch on in Britain, and with the passing of the austerity days, the bubble burst.
And so the 50s ended with parking meters, and of course the M1 motorway was opened in 1959. And there were 3 important new cars to make their debut at the 1959 Motor Show. Firstly, the Triumph Herald. It was named after the managing director's boat, and it was styled in Italy. There were 2 features about the Herald that really caught the public's imagination. Firstly, the fact that the entire bonnet opened up to give you ready access to the engine. And secondly, it had a quite amazing turning circle. In all the publicity, it was compared with that of a London cab. And from the Triumph Herald sprang the 6-cylinder Triumph Vitesse, the Spitfire, and of course the GT6 sports car.
The second release at the 1959 Motor Show was the Anglia, with its distinctive inclined rear window, and it proved an outstanding success in engineering and reliability, in spite of opposition to that design. The new engine was also to form the basis of a successful racing Formula Junior unit. Over 190,000 examples were built in 1960, the first year of production, which at the time was a manufacturing record at Ford's Dagenham factory. The Anglia lasted until 1967, when it was replaced by the Escort, which perpetuated its theme for conventional, no-nonsense mechanics at a reasonable price. The Mini, which also appeared at that renowned 1959 Motor Show, was cheap to run and above all fun to drive. A classless box on wheels, just as at home in Chelsea's Kings Road as it was in the suburbs or Bedsitter land.
Sometimes Minis stopped in heavy rain, and they did leak a little bit. The Mini is very much part of Britain in the swinging 60s, and they were raced and rallied, and would you believe some people even drove them normally. This car is a very, very special Mini. It's the first one ever made. There were in fact 3 prototypes. The first 2 were virtually tested to destruction, and this is the only one that remains. I know it's genuine because I have with me the owner of the car, a former employee of the company, Mr. Ferryman. How long have you had the car? Is it right from the moment that it was in the factory?
Yes, I booked it in the morning it arrived in the department, June 1959, as it came down from Longbridge. It did 3 years in experimental, until experimental was faded out to go to Longbridge.
Yeah.
And then I was privileged to buy this Mini.
Has it been fairly reliable?
It's very reliable model today, sir, and I've had troubles, all cars have troubles, but it's never let us down, and I've been all over Great Britain, into Scotland with it, and we've always got home quite comfortably and safely.
And how far has this gone?
I think that's the original speedometer. It read 600 miles when I drove it home on May the 8th, 1962, when the department let me have it.
Interesting to see. I'd forgotten that they had starter buttons on the floor. And
yes,
it's
yes,
all fairly primitive with sliding windows.
Oh, yes, yes.
But apart from the fact it was a prototype, it is just the same as many of the early Minis.
Exactly. Well, no, I don't think a production model was ever like it. No, it couldn't be repeated.
Would you ever part with it?
Well, I'm 80 years of age. I don't know how long I can keep it now, but I don't know what I'd do if I went in a garage and it wasn't there.
Well, here is a revelation. I've managed to find a car that is exactly the same age as myself. This was born in 1955 as well. It's actually in better condition than I am, though, because it's been reconditioned. It is an Alvis. Alvis always did things properly when it came to making cars. After all, they were British cars. They were well engineered, extremely civilized, perhaps a mite fast for the time that they were built. This one was nicknamed the Grey Lady, but its true model number was the TC 21100, and the 100 referred to the fact that this car was perfectly capable of topping 100 miles an hour. Sadly, it was one of the last Alvises to be produced with real Alvis bodywork, because their bodywork division got swallowed up by Standard Triumph, and they then had to get people like Graber, the Swiss stylist, to come and do their bodywork. And even sadder was that in 1967, Alvis just about disappeared from British roads altogether in this sort of form, because from then on they concentrated on making military vehicles rather than these beautiful machines. The Mark II Jaguar came out in 1959, hot on the heels of the Mark I, introduced in 1955. And hot on the heels of the Mark II were the police, because this turned out to be one of the most popular getaway cars for criminals of all time. In 1955, the Rolls-Royce and Bentley makes became more closely integrated. The Silver Cloud had a Rolls-Royce radiator, while the Bentley was more anonymously known as the S-Type. The interior was up to the usual luxurious Rolls-Royce traditions. Outside, you had a choice of either pressed steel bodywork, or you could get bespoke coachwork, and under the bonnet, a V8 engine. You're looking at an historic moment for British motoring, as Richard Noble, driving Thrust 2, takes the world land speed record for Britain at 633.46 miles per hour in 1983. Thrust 2 was powered by an Avon engine from a Lightning jet fighter. It developed 16,800 pounds of thrust, which is equivalent to 30,000 horsepower. Something less than that was used by Malcolm Campbell. He managed to inch ahead in the world land speed record race in 1924. And from there on, and for the next 40 years, with just one exception, when in 1928 an American briefly held the record, the land speed record became an exclusively British preserve. Henry Seagrave made his name on the racetrack. He then graduated to record breaking, and in fact, he was to lose his life attempting the water speed record. He was known as De Haim to his friends, and he was extremely popular with the motor racing crowds. He was also a hero for a generation of schoolboys. It's 1935, and the scene is set for Malcolm Campbell with the world-famous Bluebird to make his attempt on the world land speed record at Bonneville Salt Flats. He pushed the record beyond 300 miles an hour for the first time, to 301.13 miles per hour. Into the post-war years, and another British man making an attempt. John Cobb in 1947, driving his Railton Mobile Special in the USA. The record he achieved, 394.2 miles an hour. A record that was to last for 16 years.
Cobb covered the course at over 385 miles an hour on the first run and was evidently going to raise the mark this time. But it's hot work, and the car has to take on more ice while being serviced between runs. On his second go, he did over 403, reaching the astounding speed of 415 at one stage.
And after the petrol engine cars of people like Cobb and Seagrave and Campbell, it's down to the jet-powered cars of the 1980s taking the world land speed record. Cars like those of Richard Noble.
Of all the world's great motor races, the most famous has to be Le Mans. And one of the great marks imperishably associated with the Sarthe Classic is Aston Martin. They won in 1959 and achieved many, many other successes at this great race. Well, to commemorate their 50th anniversary, the Aston Martin Owners Club has uniquely recreated the Le Mans pits through the ages here at Silverstone. In fact, it's from straw bales to breeze blocks.
I think actually, talking of sports cars, probably one of the teams I enjoyed most was Aston Martin's, where we got John Wyer, a magnificent team manager who was probably the most professional amateur I've ever known. He's a guy, for instance, at Le Mans would put the hotel, shall we say, 30 miles away because the boys would like the food, you know, and he still ran a very, very tight camp. Very good indeed.
Yes, you had an enormous amount of success with Aston Martin. Was there a big difference between a team like that and Mercedes?
Oh, yes. Mercedes, I mean, were absolutely unbeatable, really. I mean, Mercedes had a big book that told you everything. If I'd said to them, look, can we try square wheels, they'd flash through and say, well, we tried it in 36 and it didn't work, or you'd have it on the next day.
They were much more difficult to drive, of course, but the thing that I always feel about them is they had so much more character. The cars seemed to have their own personalities, and you had to get to know them. Sports cars today, you know, you just get in and drive them. They don't seem to have a personality of their own. And but the old ones, you really had to get to know them and all their little vices and their quirks. And so they were much more fun to drive, although much more difficult.
This car is one of the two DBR1 Aston Martins which finished first and second at Le Mans in 1959 and incidentally won the manufacturer's World Sports Car Championship in that same year. Ian McGregor, you're very much to do with the Aston Martin Owners Club, and I must say you've got a fantastic array of cars here.
Well, thank you, Murray. Yes, we've searched the world for cars, and we have one here today. Of course, it's our Golden Jubilee year, that has come all the way from Canada, and is the first Aston that ever raced at Le Mans, driven by George Easton and Burt Batelli.
And which is your personal favourite?
My personal favourite motor car? I would still have to say this one here, although I would very much like to try and find a DB3S. But I think a lot of pennies will need to be put together to do that.
Any idea, Ian, of what it would cost to buy this lot?
Well, we valued the cars on show here for insurance purposes at £1.25 million. Then I was talking to an insurance man the day before yesterday, and he said I'd got it wrong by £250,000, you know, under.
Yes, yes.
So it's anyone's guess. At auction, certainly £1.25 million.
But how many of the owners would be prepared to sell one?
Well, owners do sell motor cars. Everyone, there comes a point when you do sell, but many of us, I think, here would rather part with our wives or anything else than we'd sell our motor cars.
Well, would that I had the money to buy one. This certainly is the most evocative display at Silverstone.
But in 1903, the Commissioner of Police for the metropolitan area had the very first police car, a rather splendid Wolseley. After the First World War, the 20s saw a tremendous expansion in motoring. There were more cars around, and it seemed everybody was hell-bent on having huge accidents. The first speed traps came in, generally consisting of a couple of officers, one with a stopwatch and waving handkerchiefs at each other. And of course, in 1928, Wolverhampton had the very first traffic lights, multicoloured affairs. Then in the 1930s, well, fabulous machinery was used by the police. Can you imagine them today riding around in Bentleys? Well, that's what the flying squad had. And as they started to train their own drivers up to a high standard, they were using such cars as the fabulous Lagonda. After the Second World War, I suppose this became the definitive police car. In the early 50s, the fabulous Wolseley, complete with a little bell on the front that got Dixon and Dock Green to the crime super quick. In the 1960s, as more and more motorways were being developed, we had the arrival of the breathalyzer. That was with us in 1967. The start of really teaching motorists to be as disciplined as possible. As we look forward into the future, it's good to see the forces now have, once again, British motorbikes supplied by the Norton Company. And have a look at that thing behind me. Yes, they are evaluating at the moment an XJS for motorway work. I really don't fancy being pulled in by one of those. Dead end. However, its HB replacement, with its Coke bottle contours, was a visual triumph.
Strange, I thought you said it was a Vauxhall. The French have an uncanny knack of imbuing their cars with that indefinable something that makes the vehicle linger in the memory, for better or for worse. The Renault Dauphine was such a model. Introduced in 1956, the rear-engine Dauphine was the first French car to sell over 2 million examples. The first million cars were sold by 1959, and the car was exported to America, but it never achieved the popularity of its rear-engine rival, the Volkswagen Beetle.
The spirit of the slightly ungainly but wholly functional Gallic approach was epitomised by the Renault 16 of 1967. There was a roomy, four-door saloon with an all-important tailgate, now so familiar, but then something of a novelty. The French have been enthusiastic motorists almost from the birth of the automobile. Their cars are indelibly stamped with their own highly individual persona, instantly identifiable to a nation that loyally supports its own industry. You won't find many Japanese cars in France.
The MGB was introduced in 1962. It was well-mannered, reliable and economical. The model ran for 18 years, but unfortunately it was disfigured from 1975 onwards by energy-absorbing rubber bumpers demanded by the all-important American market. Over 500,000 Bs were built, and with its 1980 demise went MG's Abingdon factory, its home since 1930. MG lovers everywhere felt the loss of an old friend. Triumph's best-selling sports car was the Spitfire. based on the Herald and introduced at the same 1962 motor show as the MGB. It was built for exactly the same time as the B, as both cars ceased production in 1980. The stylish Spitfire, the body was essayed by the Italian Giovanni Michelotti, was cheap to run and easy to drive, and for these reasons was much favoured by young ladies. Again, sales were aimed across the Atlantic, and the Spitfire proved the most enduring of the sports cars from Canley.
For millions of car enthusiasts around the world, this is the only classic sports car, the E-Type Jaguar. And for a whole generation of sports car fanatics, this was the ultimate bird puller. You couldn't score with an E-Type Jaguar, well, you really were in dire trouble. There wasn't a lot of room inside to do anything, but presumably if you could afford to actually run one, then you could afford to book a hotel for the weekend. When it was introduced in 1961, it was an instant sensation. Never before had there been a car with this sort of performance, top speed of 150 miles an hour, that was so affordable. It cost just a fraction over £2,000 when it was introduced. In 1971, this version came in. It was the V12, and with it, the whole style of the E-Type altered somewhat. It wasn't so much a gutsy sports car. It became, with a V12 engine, much more of a long-legged intercontinental cruiser. In 1975, Jaguar phased out the E-Type, and in many respects, I'm sure they lived to regret that decision. To run one of these, well, it can cost an absolute fortune, unless you know what you're doing. If you want to buy one already complete, fully restored, you can spend in the region of £30,000.
What is the definition of classic?
Yes, I think collectible. I think a car becomes a classic once a club has got together and started to restore them and started to organise their own spare setup and meetings, that sort of thing. Then perhaps you could say the car's beginning to get classic status.
And do you put a date on it, a start date?
Well, really, we're talking about post-war cars up to about 10 years ago. When the magazine was first started, there were meetings held about this, and they reckoned it was up to about 1965 then. But I think that we've come forward a bit.
So in, say, 10 or 15 years' time, what will be the cars of 1985 that you might start to determine they are classics at that time?
Yes. Well, what about some of the sports cars that are coming out now? I think that we're seeing a lot of new cars that indicate that motoring can still be fun. There are soft-top cars, little sports cars. Look at the MR2, the Lotus that's going to come out in a couple of years' time, the new Scimitar, and all the regular family cars seem to be coming out in convertible versions now. I would think that they will all be worth keeping and restoring in the future.
So if you've got a Cortina or a Sierra now, you should maybe stick it on bricks for the future, should you?
Oh, I should use it and enjoy it and then restore it again when the time comes. Let's not be too precious with it.
Hi. Hi. Dave, when did your love affair with the Jensen CB8 start?
Oh, when I was a small boy, I saw this very particular car in 1960 at the Earls Court Motor Show with my father, and he wished to buy the vehicle, and it was already sold. But I was always after a CV8. It just excited me to look at. And one day I found it on a used car lot, and as the Horton luck held, as we say, it turned out to be the very car, right the way back in 1974, right the way back from 1960.
Where does the money come from, and where does the time come from?
Well, in my particular case, I had an awful lot of time. I was in the London Fire Service, and due to firefighting duties, I had the misfortune of cutting my right hand off, which put me in hospital for 4 years. I then bought the vehicle, which I found, and just due care and diligence. Basically, I didn't prepare it for shows. I just prepared it to get the car back in as near original condition as I possibly could, and it was a physiotherapy exercise.
I've just shaken hands with you.
That's right.
You still do have two hands.
That's it, yes. Well, I was the first man in England to have microsurgery, and it was due to this car, so it's very special to me. Frankly, Jensen's in my book are the best in the world.
Dave, thank you very much indeed. May I shake you by the Jensen hand again?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Cheers, thank you.
Bye.
This is a Ross-style steel wheel, and it first became popular on this car, the Cortina 1600E. This model is a 1970 model, and it was introduced by Ford to try and give a sort of executive end to the very popular Cortina range. The E stood for executive. This is Brian Norman, who has reconditioned this one up to a beautiful standard. Why did you choose to recondition this model?
Because my wife wouldn't let me scrap it, and that is the simple truth.
So you'd already owned it?
We owned the car from 1972. It was actually stolen in 1981 of February. I took it home, I left it on a piece of grass outside the house where it stood right until September. And then I said to my wife, no way am I going to restore that car. She said, no way you're going to part with it, we'll have it done. And from that word go, that was it.
Now, she had a name for the car, didn't she?
She did. We bought this car simply and purely because on the back is a little motive, and she called it the Butterfly. And that's the only reason we bought this car.
Because the standards that you recondition classic cars to, I mean, they are virtually higher standards than the original production standards, aren't they?
That is what we try to aim for. This car is actually the National Standard Supreme Champion. In that sense, I have kept the car standard as it left Ford's, with just one exception, and that is the wheel and blemishes. They just set off the wheel, in my opinion. It's one of my little additives that I've put to the car. Otherwise, the car is completely basic.
Now, if you were going to part with this car, if your wife would actually let you part with this car, what sort of money would you be looking for?
Well, it's insured for £2,500. Now, that was valued over 2.5 years ago before it got to the standard that it is now. So I would say somewhere in the region of £3,000.
And how much did it cost you when you first bought it?
When I first bought it, £700.
The delights for me at Motor 100 has been the displays of competition cars. Rallying has been around for almost as long as the motor car. Between the wars, it attracted the wealthy amateur, though he gradually took a back seat in the 50s. Since then, the sport has become highly organised, with manufacturers recognising the publicity value accruing from victories, where the public could see vehicles visually the same as their own, performing astounding feats of speed and endurance. In recent years, the rally car has taken on a new dimension, particularly since the arrival of the four-wheel drive Audi Quattro. Introduced in 1980, it became the world's top rally car in 82 and 84, and is inspiring a host of imitators. An unusual rally car is this 1930 Bentley 8-litre. Although more used to circuit racing, this open-top model actually took part in the 1968 London-Sydney Marathon. Do you remember that? And also the 1974 World Cup Rally. Of all things, a Ford Zephyr 6 actually won the 1953 Monte Carlo Rally. The original of this had an aluminium body, and although it sustained many thousands of rallying miles, it was unfortunately written off by a German taxi driver, and this is a replica. Do you remember the Hillman Hunter, which had the good fortune to win the London-Sydney Marathon? Driven by Scotsman Andrew Cowan, the Hunter triumphed over much more exotic machinery and hardly missed a beat in over 10,000 miles of the world's worst roads. The Mini Cooper was developed by John Cooper of Grand Prix cars fame, who approached BMC with the idea of a hot version of the front-wheel drive Mini. It was an imaginative and very popular development. The refinements included front disc brakes, remote-control gear change, much better seats and interior, and the model enjoyed a highly successful rally life. This example, driven by Paddy Hopkirk, won the 1964 Monte Carlo Rally. Ford's answer to BMC's success with the Mini Cooper was the Lotus Cortina. It enjoyed similar success and gave rise to the boy racer image of sporty Cortina owners. The engine was Lotus's Ford-based twin overhead camshaft Elan unit. It was introduced in 1963 and was intended for track racing, but it quickly proved its worth in rallying. The GT70 was the car that Ford designed to replace the Escort. It never did. It was intended to take a variety of engines, and this one is at present fitted with an XR3 unit. The car was publicly revealed at the beginning of 1971, but the GT70 was only used in anger on just 2 occasions. It was then dropped as a project after only 4 had been built. There's absolutely no doubt that rallying has accelerated the development of the car. Without the sport, it's very doubtful whether we would today have turbocharged four-wheel drive machinery on the roads.
Well, during this 3-day event, we've seen some amazing motor cars and we've met some pretty fascinating people. But I really wonder, what do the next 100 years have in store for us, gentlemen? What do you reckon, Murray?
Well, at my age, Noel, I'm not too concerned about the next 100 years. And since a motor car is supposed to be the extension of the man, I would like to see what's left for me, with me driving around in a Porsche 944 Turbo and everybody else in a Mini. I don't think that'll happen, though. Oil is going to run out. Sir Clive Sinclair, in spite of all the stick he's taken, has got it right. We're going to have electrical cars, but whether or not they can make them to satisfy the likes of you and I and everybody else remains to be seen. I hope so.
What do you reckon, Mike?
Well, of all the cars that we've seen 100 years of motoring here, there are 2 things that haven't changed. The wheels are still round and there are 4 of them, and I don't suppose you can change that too much. But the engines have hardly changed. I mean, we're still on the old, what they call the Otto cycle, the engine that was originally developed those 100 years ago. And looking at the rallying that we've just seen as well, there's the turbocharged cars, the Quattro and the Peugeot coming in there. There's also the turbo coming into production cars now, and even there are little 1300cc cars running around now with turbos on. I think turbos are going to take us one way to more efficient engines and more powerful engines, and speed is coming back into our lives once again. But I don't know what's going to happen beyond that. Someone, I think, is going to, maybe the electric power that Murray's talking about, but maybe there's something else, some other form of power that could be harnessed, and a totally different sort of engine should emerge inside the next centenary, inside the next 100 years.
Let me just give you one thought, and that is that we've seen all these incredible people restoring motor cars at an alarming rate. The motor manufacturers of the world are turning out more cars than ever before. We must very shortly be at saturation point.
Yes. And I have the answer to that.
Yeah.
It's called a motorcycle.
Well, I certainly hope that you've enjoyed the entertainment from Silverstone over this bank holiday weekend. And that's it. My thanks to Mike and to Murray. And you can rest assured there's one bit of good news. We won't be around for Motor 200. Bye-bye.